Rafe, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rupert. Very happy to be here.
Thank you for coming in. So this is the second time that we've met up in probably the last couple of weeks, and you've been off swanning around in Iceland
That's right.
since.
It was right. And at the peak of the Northern Lights, so the entire sky lit up in red and green, and then sitting in a hot volcanic spring at the time was pretty special.
Tough times.
Yeah, very hard.
Now you're back to the doom and gloom of the
But
UK
grey
January
London.
weather. Yeah,
Yeah.
love it. Well, look, thank you very much for joining me today. We're going to get into some interesting topics. I think people will get a lot of value out of. But first of all, introduce you a bit more. So you started your career, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, by the way, but you started your career early in the telco industry, and then you've moved into working in one of the UK's leading agencies, Digitas. Most people will have heard of them for the last nearly 12 years, working on some really exciting brands. To name a couple, EE, Formula One, massive Formula One fan myself, so that's exciting for me. Um, so we're going to tuck into some of the stuff that you've done, because you've been leading teams. You're a massive advocate for diversity and inclusion. So I'd like to delve into some of the stuff that you've done there because I think that's really interesting. But yeah, can you give us a bit more of
Yeah.
an intro into who you are, your background, and where you started?
Well, like most people, I had a squiggledy career,
Yeah.
and my kind of background from a tech point of view and product is mobile, and that was because I was what would probably now be called an influencer or content creator, and back then it was kind of blogging, and that was writing about Symbian, which was the big mobile phone operating system of the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Massive market share, and it's just it's a good example of the way technology can move. But it was also before there were really smartphones, so seeing that massive seismic shift. And that was writing about them and then doing consultancy and product work off the back of that. And then, Nokia had a few problems and then Microsoft had a few problems. So I shifted into what's effectively professional services, the agency world, but working around tech product innovation and the delivery of products with some of those that you've mentioned, but also brands like the National Trust, Eon, Hastings Direct, Battersea Cats and Dogs. And it was a big shift about kind of 12 years ago from one thing, but it's interesting, the kind of variety and the versatility and having to be flexible and adaptable hasn't changed. A lot of the core skills are there. If you go back before that, I was um, I was a geographer. That was the thing I did at
Okay.
university. But the reason I mention is it because it teaches you systems thinking, which I
Okay.
think is a thread throughout my career. So that's kind of the central spine around which the squiggly bits have happened. But that I said talked about it being an influence, and I sort of say that with a wry smile, but it was about, you know, before it was a big thing, smartphones, you were writing about what impact they were going to have, much as we're now writing about AI. It was going off to phone events. It was
Yeah.
unboxing phones on YouTube before the YouTube was
Before
monetized.
before people were unboxing phones.
But
Yeah.
exactly, and then more recently, I stayed in mobile and was a kind of mobile and product strategist.
Yeah.
Um, but then that role, I think, grew out because mobile grew up a
Yeah.
lot. I
Okay.
mean, it's hard to think that, we're talking about 12 and a half years ago with the first iPhone, things like that, and now the world is completely different. Everyone has them in the pocket. We're well and truly at the top of that particular S curve.
Yeah.
But back then, you're having to do a lot of advocacy about why it was going to be a big thing and actually thinking about what you had to do to build products. And it was still, as now, those unmet customer needs and making things easier and transformation, all the kind of buzzwords, but then applying that more broadly across all elements of digital and kind of end to end. And, I have a particular view on how that should work, which I think is some of the topics we're going to get into today. But then it's also understanding how important people are.
Mm.
And I think that's where some of the inclusion and diversity came from. But everyone talks about it, it's always about the people. But I think, and it's an overused word talking about people and culture, but it is how you build the best teams. And the teams are ultimately what, deliver outcomes. And that's really what you're trying to do. And I think sometimes it's too easy to forget that and
Yeah.
forget that people are what make it up. Because a lot of that is actually longer term investments and often longer term than companies or projects think, because you're talking about multi-years a lot of the time. And so I've been a big believer always in investing in people. And it doesn't come naturally to me because I'm a bit of an introvert. And so I think I went through a bit of a almost road to Damascus conversion, saying that's the thing that's going to make it important. So when I talk about my work, I always go, it's important to have high standards and to have values, but you've got to have high humanity as well, because that's how you get to the best outcomes.
100%. And it's the thing that sometimes people forget, unfortunately, as they go down the road.
You do, and I think you get people who are good at one and the other, and the
Yes.
really best people are often have elements of both. And
Yep.
whether you call it intelligence and IQ, or whether
Yep.
you call it empathy and kind of intelligence, there's lots of different ways of talking about it. And I think people recognize the X factor when they see it, but also it's important to build teams that have diversity even within the spectrum I'm talking about there. And I think that's something it took me a while to realize, and that's sort of hopefully the hallmark of some of my leadership.
And so talk me through the transition, if you like. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but from like mobile strategist all the way through to CPTO, which is where you have been most recently. Like, how have you managed to come through the gears into what are obviously different roles, but there are similarities between what you were doing, I'm sure, as a mobile strategist to what you've been doing most recently as a CPTO?
Yeah, I think I spoke about it being systems design.
Yeah.
And actually, when it comes down to it, designing the systems on which your product works or on what your team work is similar. But I think it is combining kind of thinking about business, the viability of something, thinking about customers, sort of the desirability, and also then the technical side, feasibility. And I think with mobile strategy, it was much more around what's the business, what does the customer want, and then I've had to develop the muscle more around technical feasibility. And those things are three things that often get talked about by product people. So I would describe myself as a product first
Hmm.
technology leader, because that's the way I've come to it. And everyone comes to it from different ways. You often see CTPOs come either from the technical or the product side. I always had a little bit of both because I had a curiosity about technology. And I actually think that's one of the common threads as well. You've always wanted to be pushing the edge, continuous improvement, and that's often driven by a sense of curiosity. So in terms of how it happened, I had to cut my teeth on kind of building products, and the first product I built was actually the websites and the apps that ran what were the all about sites, and that was the content creation,
Yeah.
the stuff around mobile, and then going into Digitas, it was creating some of those products for some of the big brands, big mobile apps that were about digital transformation. Often it was about reducing the cost to serve, moving people from call centers to mobile apps, kind of to be able to self-serve.
Mm.
And you had to think about, how are you going to make that work for the business as well as the customer? And as that grew up, it's kind of almost a question of scale. And I think the difference for a CPTO is you are not necessarily running tech or running product. You have to own the full outcome chain. So you have to think about the strategy and then think about how you're going to build and run the products, but also then measure and improve them. And it's the last two that often get forgotten about, um, because that kind of iterative nature. And that has been a shift, I think, in the last decade. I mean,
Mm.
this is what startups do all the time. It is
Yeah.
not, I'm not saying anything novel
Yeah. Yeah.
or anything new. It is harder, I think, sometimes in the bigger, more mature, established companies. And it's, whether you talk about that as business transformation, agile transformation, it's actually the principles are the same. You are trying to, or digital transformation, you are trying to shift something into the digital domain. And mobile, I think, was really helpful for that because it
Mm.
did put a computer in everybody's pocket and it did make it easy to use. And it made people realize that that was something that was going to fairly fundamentally alter
Yeah.
how people go about their lives. And it's hard, if you think back, 15 years or 20 years, not everyone had a computer at home. The idea that you would just use your banking app all the time, that's really quite big
It's novel.
shifts.
Right? You go to the
Um,
library, wouldn't you? For
exactly, and it's the same with access to information, whether
yeah.
that's social media content, whether that's news content, and so growing up while creating products in that time, and as I said, it was for companies like Hastings Direct, the National Trust, Virgin Atlantic. I was the what would now be called a product manager
Yep.
on those, but also often doing some of the technical side as well, because I think with mobile apps you had quite small teams creating them, and then as that evolved, it was like, okay, how do we do this at scale, and growing up to bigger teams of hundreds of people running across. First, it was like 3 or 4 at the same time, and then it was actually a whole portfolio of things, and you actually become an integrator of integrators. You start being, having to think much more about the system and how you're going to create the teams
Mm.
rather than individually. And it's about pattern recognition. You start to see the same patterns, and a lot of it is actually having that gut instinct to make a decision. Ideally, that decision should always be evidence based,
Yep.
but you do need to have a kind of almost unerring instinct to make that first leap or to make that first decision and set, this is how we're going to do it. So people often talk about the what and the how, and I think it is what and why are we doing this? That's typically the domain of product, and then how are we going to do it, which is the domain of technology. So build the right thing, build it the right way. And I started in build the right thing and then moved more into build it the right way as well. And that's why
Yep.
I describe myself as kind of a product first technology leader. But it's when you're in it, you don't really realize it's going on. And then I look back now and realize I've had 4 or 5 different jobs through the years, each of which has taken on a new set of skills. And as I said earlier, through that, people and building teams became more important. And I think that's the interesting thing about being a CPTO.
Mm.
Your most important product is actually the operating model and the
Okay.
team that you create. That's then how prioritization happens, how teams ship, how you get to value, how decisions get made, because that's the thing that then makes it replicable, scalable, and you get to outcomes. And there's a huge like commercial part to that. And the big difference is you can't hide behind the things that often happen in tech. You can't say the requirements weren't clear because ultimately you were accountable and
Yep.
responsible for those. You can't say it's a business problem because you're meant to be solving a business problem depending on what that unmet need is, nor can you really say it's ops or the delivery model because you're responsible for that. And so it is, I mean, I sometimes describe it, you have to be a bit of a polymath, SME across lots of things. But the real secret is, of course, you're not. You actually get the team in place beneath you
Yep.
who can do that, but you need to know enough to be able to guide them. And so I think for someone like me coming up through mobile, where I'd had to do a bit of everything because it was quite nascent, because it was small teams, gave me a broad view across all the skill sets that were required. And then I've continued to develop that because I think, in my experience, the best, not just chief product and chief technology officers, but CPTOs in general need to be able to get into the detail when there is something that comes up because you're guiding people who are often a little bit earlier in their career, and then you're working with people who are clearly a lot smarter than you because they are specialists, they are brilliant at
Mm.
what they do, but you sometimes have to make them realize the trade-offs that sit in their particular domain against something else. And so you build credibility by being the person who can say, yes, we can do that. But here you need to understand the cost, the risk, and the path. And you need to understand it across all the domains that you operate in. And I make it sound really grand and complicated. It's not. It really is about making sure you have a laser view on what outcome you want to get to and what all the trade-offs are to get there. So it is holding a lot in your brain at the same time, but you are absolutely dependent. Like any good technical thing, there's dependencies. You're
Yep.
dependent on the people and the team around you.
And you mentioned earlier that companies miss the measure part of what you do in terms of measuring the outcomes. It's such a crucial bit. Like why on earth would people miss that out? Like what are they doing?
I think it's often down to incentives.
Yeah.
So sometimes the incentive is we want to get this thing delivered, and actually that's not what you want to do. You
Yeah.
want to have the thing delivered that has an outcome. I think also measuring things is harder than people realize. It's not just the kind of vanity metrics, and you can look at it as we can look at it from a business point of view. There are commercial objectives, revenue objectives you need to meet, but then there'll also be brand objectives, which can be harder to measure. And then the technical measures, typically DORA type measurements where how fast are you deploying, what's the failure rate. But I think getting back to the reason it's difficult is because it requires cross discipline buy in and agreement on what that outcome is and what you're going to measure. And a lot of the time, people jump to the thing right at the end, the lagging metrics, but they often take quite a while to become apparent. So, my advice is always look for the leading indicators when
Mm.
you're measuring things. And that can be something like you're starting to see adoption of an app, but you're not yet starting to see the revenue off the back of that. And that can be applied to the whole thing or to a small feature. So you look at something like onboarding.
Hmm.
Are you getting people successfully into the onboarding process? If you're not, something's probably breaking in acquisition. How much are you getting people through each stage of onboarding? And you can look at that. And sometimes it's just as simple as people haven't instrumented it. So making sure you've got clear instrumentation in place. Once you've got all of that, making the data understandable and comparable
Okay.
to a broad audience is important. So it's rarely one thing that breaks, but I think it's more because a lot of the time, outcomes are mistaken for outputs.
Hmm.
And I think that's the classic mistake I see most companies make,
Yep.
because it's not easier to measure output than it is outcome, but it's performative if you do that.
And you say about making the data easy to understand, and I appreciate you're not a data engineer or data analyst,
Mhm.
but how do people go out and do that? Is it by putting it into dashboards, making it simple to view so it's got nice
The
colors, graphs, things like that? I don't know.
the simplest version of that is
Yeah.
dashboards, but actually, and design and making data beautiful is really important, because you want the thing that can be looked at in 30 seconds, and you want the thing that can be looked at in half an hour. But actually, I think far more important is the thing that you're measuring, because otherwise people just look at them at like vanity metrics and see that's going up, and looking at the trends is important. Um, but I think make a lot of the time it's making sure you're actually measuring the right thing, not just the load of a page. It's, are people interacting with that thing on the page? Are they getting that step along the customer
Mm.
journey? Are they getting to a micro outcome? Because bear in mind, every outcome is made up of lots of steps along a journey, and looking at that rather than just looking at, is it breaking at the end, or is it, the metric at the beginning. And there is a data engineering element to it, in that you have to make data consistent. You need to be able to look at it over time.
Mhm.
Quite a lot of the time measurement gets broken when there's a new release or something else comes out, or a re-platform or a rebuild of the product, and suddenly you wipe away all your before and after comparisons. And there's plenty of ways around that with smart data engineering, but also making sure your data isn't locked in one measurement silo. Especially now, there are lots and lots of ways where you can use intelligent dashboards or business intelligence tools, and you're often combining it from other sources of data into one thing. So treating data as a product, as a thing that's going to be valuable, and recognizing when you're working on a product, it's probably got to fit in with the data much more broadly in a company, is really important, because otherwise you're just creating the same kind of silo that people rail against whenever you're building something or creating an experience. But I don't think data is often thought about as a product, or at least not as much as it should be.
Mm. I think it's being thought of more now. People realize the value of data, on the most part, I'd say.
Yes. I mean, people always talk about data being valuable, and data isn't valuable on its own.
No, you need
What
to.
you do with the
Yes.
data is valuable. And I think that realization has come. Um, and then combining it with customer data to actually, and this is where things like automation and personalization start becoming really important topics. But the way people behave often tells you more than anything else, because what they tell you they do isn't always the same
Yeah.
as what they actually do.
Shock people lie.
And you can also use, it as proxy. If they do something, they'll probably be able to do something else. And that's
Yeah.
how you get to personalization, next best actions, and things like that. And so data is often just seen as a thing that you measure afterwards, but actually you should be using it all the time as a way to iterate on not just what you're doing, but on what you present to the user. And I think, we are starting to see now a lot more adaptive experience design, or adaptive UI.
Mhm.
AI is starting to really bring that in. You are not going to be able to do that in an intelligent way if you don't have the kind of real time data. So that's the other big trend, kind of real time data
Yep.
measurement, not just a dashboard or a monthly report. You want to be able to look at a snapshot immediately to then be able to make a smart decision about what the next thing to show that person is, or to see how real time is. And there are plenty of examples of this, like the whole advertising industry, all of media is built up on making real time decisions. That's basically what programmatic does.
Yep.
So that's what's interesting being in an agency. You often sometimes can take things that are from other areas and apply that expertise, or apply that knowledge in new ways.
I think it's an important thing that most business leaders, like C-suite, CEO, for example, they want like real time data. They want to make decisions in real time rather than the traditional ways of doing things. You get your accounts given to you like 3 months after the fact. It's too late. Like,
Yeah.
what's
Well,
the
that's the
point?
joy
Where's
of
the value?
digital. It can be real
Yeah,
time. There can be a danger in that because don't jump
yeah,
at things that happen, and there's seasonality and times
yeah.
of day and weather and everything else can affect this. I mean, when we're working with someone like Formula One, of course, there's an on season and off season, but there's also pre, during, and post weekends, and fans of Formula One behave very differently during those periods, and what they want and
Mm,
what their unmet needs are different during that period. But being able to look at that and go, okay, that's what we need to do at that time. That's really, really important. But yes, particularly around revenue and things like that, I think digital transformation has given boards the ability to look at things almost like day to day. And whether that's a big telco, they know how much broadband is being sold. They know the mobile contracts. They know what happens when there's a new phone launch, and so they can see and measure that. Or working with Samsung, looking real time at kind of what the effect of a launch event
mm,
is or what the effect of a campaign is becomes crucially important. But navigating that, I think, actually often needs the same instincts that you have in product, which is like business impact, what's the customer impact, what's the desirability, and is it then feasible to do something off it? Because, as I said, having the data doesn't necessarily isn't the end. It's what you then choose to do with it that's really important, and comes back to what I spoke right at the beginning: better decisions.
and we talked a bit about Formula One. We've
Mhm.
mentioned it a couple of times. Can we talk about that particular piece of work
Sure.
for a bit? Because I think it's a really interesting piece of work. Not only is it Formula One, most people have heard of Formula One, um, but it's the ability to have an impact on millions of people because it's so many fans in that area. So tell us a bit more about some of the work you've done and what are the things that you've seen throughout your time working with them.
Formula One are an amazing organization, and it was a real privilege to be able to rebuild their products, and what that was the website, the mobile app in their core products. Um, Started working with them after the acquisition by Liberty Media, which was a change from the Bernie Ecclestone era.
Hmm.
So Formula One fans would understand what that meant, and digital had not been a priority. Um, but suddenly it was like, we need to concentrate on this. We need some support, and so that was a case of, in a relatively short period of time, creating the foundations for what they have today in their digital product suite, working very closely with the team at Formula One. It's often the case that the best teams, I think, are hybrid,
Hmm.
mixed. But what it really was, it came down to something quite simple. It was, how do we get fans closer to the action? Because at most 100,000, couple of 100,000 people can go to any race weekend, and they're all around the world. There are hundreds of millions of Formula One fans, and the digital audience has grown immeasurably. Formula One's own numbers show that increasing from 50 to 300 million. That's
Yeah,
in the public domain. And the digital products were an incredibly important part of that. But really, it was going, okay, what do fans want? And they wanted access to more content. They wanted access to kind of sports data. What I mean by that is the timing information, the
yeah,
telematics information, where they were on the circuit. There's some really interesting behavior around second and third screening with Formula One fans, because they're often using digital products while watching
yeah.
either live at the race
So they
or
can
on
see the
TV,
timings or
so they
follow
can
a
see all the
specific
timings.
driver.
And then there's the drivers and the teams, and
Yeah.
they are actually quite specific behaviors. Despite what a lot of people think, they're not connected to Formula One directly as an organization, but of
Hmm.
course, people have favorite teams and drivers. And so it was thinking about, how do you make that simple enough to understand? And it got more and more complicated because there was also the Netflix Drive to Survive, a new generation of fans coming in. To begin with, it was quite an old audience, and how do you appeal? And you were not going to increase the audience by sticking with just what the core fans were back in, I guess it was sort of 2015 or so. Um, and then it was, thinking about, well, once you've done that, how do you keep iterating?
Mm.
And, Formula One had some incredibly smart products and technology people, but they were partnering with an agency because they wanted to be able to move quickly. They wanted to be able to get some of the skills and the perspective from elsewhere. But there are so many fun things within that. There's some amazing technology, having to scale up at race weekends using the cloud
Yep.
to kind of scale the particularly things like the live timing data, but also thinking about how can you make the content publishing as fast as possible. And there's under Formula One, there's a composable architecture that at the time was quite a big leap to take. Now it's like standard
Yep.
practice. No one would bat an eyelid at it. Um, but also thinking about how you would have the difference between what was on the web, what was on the app, the different experiences. I spoke earlier about kind of what you showed before the race, during the race, and after the race. And of course, during the race, you really wanted to bring to prominence the fact there was a race going on. And so having kind of a race tracker that showed that in real time with the data being streamed was really important, but also thinking about the different tiers of the product, for more casual fans and for the more dedicated fans and the die-hard fans. It was really quite a complicated thing to think through, but it needed to be simplified down in
Mm.
order to make it something that was deliverable. And then since then, there's been a lot of the things I was talking about earlier, born out of the experience of building those products.
Nice. And you talked a bit about some of the technology and like it being groundbreaking at the time, now pretty standard practice. Like, as a technology leader, how do you decipher things that are effectively going to be fads? Like we talk about bubble of AI, whether it's a bubble or not, who knows? I think it's here to stay, from my opinion. But how do you go through and work out when things are perhaps in a bit of a hype bubble, as opposed to being genuinely useful in what we're doing in our everyday lives and work?
I mean, it's a great question. And I think emerging technology and actually technology choices really should follow the same framework, but it's just about how you make that decision, what kind of thing you are making that decision against. And when I say that is you need to look at things like speed and quality and customer experience and unit economics and decision when you're making a choice about your technology, whether that's the architecture or the strategy itself. I think with emerging technology and AI, I don't really think is in that category
Yeah.
anymore.
It's emerged.
Elements of it are,
Yeah.
but you can, it's the S curves. We've had mobile, we had social. The metaverse is an interesting one because I think that's a thing that probably didn't deliver on the hype that was around. And AI, I think, is both going to be smaller and bigger. I mean, it's a classic thing. People always overestimate the short term
Mm.
impact and underestimate the long term impact. But I think it actually goes back to you need to look at don't use technology for technology's sake. What problem are you trying to
Mm.
solve? And that can come back to a customer problem or it can come back to a business problem. For something like Formula One, a headless composable architecture made sense because there were always going to be multiple channels in which that content needed to get out into the world and the content needed to be published as fast as possible. So decoupling, having the multi-tier architecture was a no-brainer. And uh, the risky thing there was choosing the one that was going to be right in terms of the supplier and vendor. And Formula One are publicly on the record as using Contentful, so it's okay to
Yep.
mention that. There's a whole bunch of other technology choices there, but they were all based around the what's often those decisions have to have a kind of decade long kind of timeline because that's most tech architectures do need to think in at least 10-year cycles because of the investment involved and platforms are very different to campaigns in that respect. But then when you apply that to kind of emerging technology, it's I think having a culture of experimentation
Yep.
is important for things that are on the edge. And then the hard thing is when do you move it from what's effectively a lab or experimentation into kind of mainstream. And it's also important that that culture of experimentation should run through everything. So, yes, it's most often talked about with innovation and emerging technology, but having a culture of experimentation is at the heart of how you deliver product well. And, startups talk about fail fast. It's all actually the same thing.
Yeah.
It's validate something as quickly and as early as possible. And it's what product people will talk about as continuous discovery. There are different words for it, but all of it comes down to the same things. Try and validate as early as possible whether it's going to have value. And I think the bit that people sometimes get caught on is what is value.
Mm.
And sometimes with emerging tech, there's actually value in just experimenting to find out whether it's going to be relevant or not. And frankly, a failed experiment or it's not going to be work is just as valuable as something that works really well. Sometimes it's actually about, I want to position my brand as being on the leading edge of technology. And most of the metaverse activations that I was involved in or actually had that. There was a realization there wasn't going to be a commercial outcome. But the biggest decisions and the biggest investments still need to come back to, is there going to be a real benefit for the customer that is going to drive a business outcome?
Mhm.
Or is it going to drive kind of customer loyalty or something like that? And as I said, there's lots of ways of measuring value, but I mean, most of the time it does come back down to the bottom line.
Yeah.
I I think it's important sometimes to have innovation for the sake of art and for the sake of learning, because otherwise organizations become very stagnant and become a bit backward looking. And there is actually an expectation for a lot of people to be on the edge. And Formula One's a great example because people expect it to be innovative and
Yeah.
forward looking because that is part of the brand. And I think that's that sometimes when I was talking about the trade-offs between technology, product, and then kind of creative and campaign, all of those things come together, which is why it can be a very hard job. Because when you're talking to stakeholders, there's a degree of pragmatism, but there's also a degree of, okay, that decision has to be grounded in some rational thought,
Yeah.
ideally some evidence-based data. And so when you ask me a question about, how do you decide what to back, it is so dependent on the circumstances. But if someone can't articulate to you why in 2 minutes they've made a decision, that's probably the sign it hasn't been thought about carefully.
And you talked about the metaverse. I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you think it's dead?
I think the metaverse has just changed into other things. And so I think metaverse got conflated with gaming, and gaming is absolutely massive culturally. You,
Yeah.
you only need to look at Roblox. I think VR that also got rolled into that hasn't been as big as maybe everyone thought it would be. But I would say, if I was, you put me on the spot, I think we are still going to see another paradigm shift in computing. And I do think things around smart glasses and things like that are really interesting, but I don't think it's going to be as rapid as the adoption
Mm.
of, say, mobile was. It's taken a while, but if you look at AI first devices, they are probably going to be wearables and some kind of glasses, some kind of overlay of combining the physical and digital world will come together. But I think that's very different from some of the original metaverse vision, which was kind of this idea of virtual worlds.
Mm.
I think it will be much more around kind of the XR rather than the
The
VR.
real world mixing with the virtual
Yes.
world, because yeah, I think most people actually, whilst there's big following still for people who like the virtual world, most people don't want to
And
go to a virtual world as well as living in the real world.
it's not mainstream in
No.
the way that kind of people using mobile apps are. And
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, there's lots of there's lots of money. There's, Meta have sold tens of millions of the Oculus
Yeah.
devices and are still pushing on it. But has it created the return that was expected? No. But
Yeah.
I tend to be a bit of an optimist about technology. And as I said, I think looking at the next cycle, I think AI first devices are going to bring in some of those elements of the metaverse and combining the physical and digital world, just being able to look at things and query the world around you, have things overlaid. I mean, maybe I say that because I wear glasses,
Yeah.
so it's easy.
You
But
get away with it.
I also don't think we are at the peak with just the slab of glass that's in everyone's pockets.
Yeah.
There's more still to come, a lot more multimodal devices.
Well, bringing out there's like Johnny Ives looking at creating this thing in your pocket, the top pocket or pin that goes on you for recording everything you
Yeah.
say. Again, I'm not sure how I feel about it yet because
Uh,
I
there's
don't know
always
if I
a
want everything recorded, but
there's always a societal acceptance factor on
yeah,
all of these things. But I think the most surprising thing would be if the world doesn't change.
yeah,
That is the least likely scenario. And we're probably overdue something because, mobile does, date back a decade.
hmm,
And yes, the iPhone and the Android devices have got more and more sophisticated, but they are starting to control more and more things around them. And whether that's things like the smart home, whether that's smart offices, smart roads, there's a lot more, I think, still to come there. And it's interesting. I personally feel that one of the things about AI is it is going to increase the tendency for software to eat the world because it makes it easier for you to create software for quite niche use cases. And you talk about not wanting to have things recorded all the time. I think the idea of always on, it will just be another bit of acceptance in the same way that people would have probably been aghast about the thought of a telephone being with people all the time and people being contactable all the time. But there are, societal shift like that are really difficult as technologists to kind of read. And that's one of my jobs has been to look at what's coming. And as I said, people underestimate it in the long term, overestimate it in the short term. So I
Mm.
don't think this will be immediate, but the AI is disruptive because it is changing the velocity at which it's possible to deliver things and change. And you could get into a whole conversation
Yeah.
around AGI and stuff like that, which probably not the purpose of this, but thinking about that, if you wound back 15 years and asked
Yeah.
people to predict what the smartphone would do in a kind of 5, 10 year period, we are at that point where we are going to have the same with AI first devices, but I think the difference is it will happen in a couple of years, not over a decade.
Yeah, good. And I think these things should happen sort of slowly in the sense of we've all saw how AI has failed in organizations whereby people have been told you need to implement AI and people just implement it. And it comes back to that they're
The
not doing it for the user, looking at the human need rather than the technology.
You're absolutely right. And the biggest thing you learn about digital transformation and product is that organizations are slow. They are
Yeah,
like oil tankers. And there's inertia, often for very good reason. And I think that also comes back to things like inclusion and belonging. Not everybody wants to adopt those things. There are still portions of the population who don't use banking apps, which will probably horrify everyone listening to this podcast. But, it's at about 90, 95%. So, you have to be careful that people don't become unbanked. It's going to be the same with AI. Not everyone adopts it. And people who use ChatGPT, and yes, it's had the fastest ramp up to 800 million users pretty much ever. And that's what worries me is not that technology will become bad. It's just actually approaching the point where it's happening faster than humans' ability to adapt and be
yeah.
flexible, solve it. Because actually, most people now are perfectly comfortable using a smartphone, but it's going to be disruptive, or it already is disruptive. I
Yeah, I
mean,
was
you
going to
just
say
need
it's
to look
there.
at it data. I was preparing for this podcast, and I'll be honest, rather than listen to the past 20 episodes, I stuck them into
Yeah,
Notebook LM and asked it to summarize what were the kind of topics, what were the kind of conversations that happened. That took me 15 minutes versus having to listen to 10 hours of audio. That kind of behavior is going to become more and more apparent, and it will become something that just happens with an assistant in your ear or overlaid in the
yeah.
real world. And so I'm a techno utopian, so I actually look forward to that. But
You look excited. Yeah.
I do worry about the effects on designing for everyone, on inclusion, and all those kind of
Mm.
things. It's drifted slightly off your question
No,
there.
it's good though. And coming back to like the human side of things, you talked about inclusion, designing for inclusion. As I mentioned, you've been an advocate for diversity, inclusion, and building teams. Um, I don't want to say it's a tick box exercise for certainly not for most companies, but some companies it probably is a tick box exercise. I think that's fair to say. And it's not as easy as just going, well, yeah, I mean, most people want to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. I think that's probably a fair statement to say, but it's not as easy to do it as to say it. It's one of those things easier said than done. So, how do you go about intentionally building out a diverse workforce and team without ultimately making sacrifices so that you are excluding people to be purposefully inclusive? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and the work for that never stops.
Yeah.
Uh, it has to be a deliberate and conscious decision, and you have to advocate for it, and you have to be the change that you want to see in the world. And I've had colleagues who kind of opened my eyes and made me realize that. And I am kind of a walking example of privilege in that sense, white, male, southeast of the UK, went to university, etc. And I think until you realize that other people have very different experiences, you don't really realize the power of having those perspectives inside a team.
Mm.
But for me, it's actually driven by fundamentally try and make the world a fairer place. And you can do that by the actions and the decisions you make. Now, of course, there are things you can do as a leader, and there are things, well accepted best practice like, blind CVs and trying to remove bias from the recruitment process. But I think that's not really enough. You actually have to make a deliberate effort to go, I'm going to make things different. I'm going to try and build a more diverse team because there is no question in my mind more diverse teams create better experiences and better products because they're more representative of the people that are going to be using them. And they also bring new ideas and fresh thinking And I think you also create teams that are happier and more inclusive. And a lot of those are really difficult to measure. And you do probably have to push against them because sometimes the easy thing is to just go, we'll keep on doing what we did before. So I'm talking very much about people and teams there, but there is another side of it. Sometimes it gets talked about as being, tech for good. But
Mm,
again, it just comes back to it's about real outcomes. And you sort of said it. And yes, it's absolutely sometimes a checkbox exercise, and it's quite distressing to see that happen. Although equally well, you can use that to inject or achieve the outcomes that you're actually trying to get to.
mm,
And more recently, with accessibility, the kind of things like the EAA and government regulation have actually put it up the agenda because there's like big fines. It's basically the equivalent of GDPR, particularly last summer when the kind of EAA came into force. Um, but it's also that's actually a good thing to do because if you design for everyone, you make it better for everyone. I think too often accessibility is seen as, it's for the, one third of people that have a disability. No, if you make a product better, you make it better for
mm,
everyone. Because generally those things are around, latency and performance, around comprehension, understandability, the core principles that all the accessibility will also talk about. But it's also about reducing customer harm, removing dark patterns, removing frustration. And I will say it's absolutely possible to, build products in an evil way,
yeah,
get people hooked and addicted. And you have to make some, that's the trade-offs I was talking about earlier. And you do have to think about those quite carefully. But then it is also things like sustainability or reduce bias in decisioning. And like the first of those is much more around infrastructure from a technology point of view. What is your underlying cloud infrastructure? What's your page weight? And there can be a trade off about how many videos you put in and things like that. AI is going to be really important there because what model you choose will dictate how much computers use and what the energy is underneath that. But even that is a complicated topic because with renewable energy and even the new tech around kind of mini nuclear reactors, like, is that going to be such a
yeah,
big deal? But I also think it's then around kind of transparency and user controls. And this is something we're seeing come in a lot more. Privacy by design is something that's really important to give control back to users.
yeah,
And again, with AI sort of being transparent about what's AI, what's human, the handovers between that. Um, and all of those topics I've just talked about are things that you can do, whether that's accessibility, sustainability, privacy, and it is sort of driven by, at the moment, I would say mostly by regulation and compliance. But I think there will be an advantage to those that actually go for good for the trade offs because I think people are becoming more and more aware of those. And so, in a role as CTPO, you are trying to make those ethics actionable by putting in place guardrails, by putting in review processes, by having the North Star auditability, I should say.
yeah,
And that becomes, I think, vitally important. But my experience is you only get that if you have the diverse, inclusive teams in place, because you will find that humans are quite different.
yeah,
And some people care deeply and passionately about these. There are people I've worked with who are brilliant at understanding and articulating the benefits of accessibility. And, you know, with Formula One, we've actually made that one of the most accessible websites and one of the most high performing. It does really well in the Google scoring around that, and that's because accessibility was baked in from the very beginning, and
mm,
it was designed for very deliberately, a very conscious decision. And I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't had the right people in the team. And so, for me, it comes full circle back to as a technology leader, you have a fundamental responsibility. And like technology has problems with diversity. There is the mix between men and women. Things like the gender pay gap are ways of measuring that that you have to look at.
mhm,
But then it's also about social mobility. It's about neurodiversity. All those elements and often crossing over as well. All of those elements are really important to think about. And I don't think it happens unless you lead by example as a leader, and that is in your hiring decisions, in the way you treat people, in the way you advocate for people. And, culture gets talked about all the time, but it becomes really evident if you have it,
mm.
and you can see it in the teams and you can see it in the products if you know what to look for. And that's why I'm actually very passionate about it. and it's very easy for that to become just a checkbox or a thing that you do for performance reasons. I would say the companies I admire most are the ones that just do it because it's the right thing to do, and then don't do a press release about it and
Yeah.
don't shout about it. And you will see they get clusters of talent, and that has always been the driver for me. Um, can you make it a bit fairer?
Yeah. And
Because actually, it's good business.
have you ever seen it go wrong?
Um, I think like everything, it can go wrong because you don't get the decision right and you are limited by your own framing and experience. And I've been fortunate to be taught by my colleagues. I was part of the business resource group, Viva Women, um, and it was made me realize that don't talk about it, do it.
Yeah.
And I think there's often a lot of talk about it and not enough of doing it. And you cannot substitute for real experience. And I guess the best example of this is you can build a product, but if you don't include the people that you're building it for, you will not get it right.
Yeah.
And that can be in things like health, it can be in charities. Make sure you are engaging with, and whether that's, it can be like user research, but ideally, the best products are actually you bring the users into the building process, into discovery, and the best intentions of people who don't have that lived experience, and whether that's a health condition they suffer from, or you know they don't own a cat or a dog,
Yep.
and like trying to understand what that means. And so I think you have to be really careful to intent, and good intentions is not the same as good outcomes. And so, yes, I've seen it go
Yep.
wrong plenty of times, and it's very often not deliberate. Um, Humans are messy,
Yeah.
and it's really hard to get it right. So that self awareness to always be looking at it and always be an active listener on those things, and your team will often know. And so listening to sometimes the smaller voice is a really important part of being a leader.
And the role of leaders in technology, it's changed as we've gone through time, and it's continues to change. It makes our job as recruiters for my business very difficult, but that's all right. That's why we still exist, because if it wasn't difficult, we wouldn't be needed. So I'm happy with that. Um, but even like saying job titles change. Of CPTO wasn't a thing. Maybe like 7 years ago, I didn't really see that many
No,
people in that role. I'm sure there were people who were doing that role. And product, you know, 10 years ago, product management wasn't such a thing. UX design wasn't such a thing 15 years ago, but people were doing it, just not called that.
yeah.
So where's the role of technology leadership going, and what's changing?
I mean, I think the role titles always lag behind what's happening,
Yeah.
probably by 5 years or so. I think the biggest things, I mean, so maybe just talk about CPTOs just for a moment, because I think it's illustrative of what's happening. Previously, it was about being a tech leader or a product leader. But to get to what I think is the right thing, outcomes, you had to own them together. And you could do that by having a team of people. But the role of CPTO came about really because it was like the gold standard for
Mm.
getting to those things. And it sort of removed some of the risk of messy people interacting with each other. I think it's actually quite hard to do really well. And of course, I'm going to say that
Yeah.
as one of them. But I think it does require a certain mindset. And the reason I talk about mindset is because I think that's the thing that's shifting in tech leaders. They were seen very much as kind of delivery workhorses, but actually, as tech has become more and more broad and more embedded, actually, you have to become almost a controller of an operator of social technical systems. And it comes back to what I was talking about with people
Mm.
earlier. Um, and so it's not just being responsible for owning the technology. You have to be responsible for owning the outcomes and what that technology causes, both the good and the bad harm that we were talking about earlier. And you have to be able to navigate that in a way that I think is probably much more people centric
Yeah.
than the early CTOs. And I think AI is actually accelerating that shift because it's actually removing execution and building as the big bottleneck. that is not going to happen overnight. And for all the CTOs listening, I'm not one of those people who believes all the jobs are going to disappear. I actually think it's going to result in more work in
Mm,
technology because, as I said earlier, it will mean that it makes more realistic to build software for quite small use cases. But what it does mean is that you are going to be able to kind of test and prototype things way more easily than you used to. So it's going to become even more important to get those requirements right, to get that validation of early discovery, because the risk equation is going to get bigger and
yep.
bigger. And so technology leaders are going to have to become much more fluent in handling risk, in handling legal and compliance. And it's not necessarily doing it themselves, but it's how do you integrate it in? And just as product brought in kind of customer centricism or UX and everything else, all the
Mhm,
things you could talk about. I mean, if we'd been having this conversation 5 years ago, we'd have been talking about kind of design thinking, product thinking, user centric design. That that debate is over. Like
mhm,
that's already
yeah.
happening. But what you're going to have to equip yourself with next, just as, maybe 10 years ago it was data, it's going to be how can you make those decisions about trade-offs on automation, on AI, and what are the kind of new skill profiles that are going to be needed for that? What are going to be the new governance? And so I think there'll be a greater emphasis on things like platform strategy, measurement and experimentation, security and resilience, a little bit of organization design in a way that is broader than we
Mm,
have it right now, and will touch on more parts of the organization. So, I mean, you could summarize down the tech leaders of tomorrow need to become multipliers, creating better teams, making better decisions, and building better systems, not the kind of heroic, we will deliver this when we say we will. And so it is more hybrid
mhm,
leadership, I think is the way I'll describe it. So you will own both the strategy and the excellence of delivery, and that's a big ask. And I think there's still a lot of questions about what that looks like and how that will happen. And for me, things like AI are just bringing that decision in faster because s- good example is what does a team shape look like
yeah,
in 5 years' time or even next year, frankly. And it used to be pyramidal. Now it's actually what is some of that pyramid made up of AI agents
yeah.
or things like that. My view on AI is actually there's two things you have to worry about. One of which is the kind of automation and removing humans as much as possible because it makes things infinitely scalable and repeatable processes and businesses that can be built like that. You will get a unicorn built with one or two people, but that isn't going to replace everything.
No.
It's much more the centaur effect, which is half AI, half human. And that's what the jagged frontier of AI is, which is the redesign of workflow processes. And those will look different. But what's so exciting about that is it's a bit like the way mobile opened up all kinds of new use cases and new possibilities. Exactly the same thing is going to happen with AI. But to be prepared for that, I think, and of course I'm a little biased in saying this, I think having more product thinking and having
Mhm.
more people who think about product, which is people and business outcomes, as well as the elegance of the technology to do it, is going to be really important.
I think, as you say, product can be at the forefront of all of this, in my opinion. I'm equally biased, if not a little more so. Um, but I genuinely think it's an opportunity for people in the product world to get more involved with the understanding of the technology and how it all works to really facilitate.
Yes, and I think it's almost having orchestration skills,
Mm.
and I think you have to be really careful for product people not to gatekeep product.
Yep.
Everyone is able to contribute to product, and actually, is go back to it's a mindset about being opening up your mind to a slightly wider set of things. And, the best product people I've worked with are skilled across multiple areas, but they're deep experts in one area. But what they have in common is the ability to bring teams together to act as the glue. And it's often quite invisible work and it can be quite thankless. And working with stakeholders who don't get it can be very tiring.
Mm.
But when you get it right, it results in kind of the best feeling because not only are you creating, and there's something nice about creating something, getting it out in the world. You can also see the impact it has on the team around you, on people, and then the people that you're building for. And yes, it has a value and a business outcome that's revenue or financial as well. And so what drives that is, as I said, the orchestration of the future.
Yep. You talked there about working with stakeholders that don't get it. I think that most people, if they've been in the tech world, product world in any way, shape, or form over the last 6 months, they'll probably have worked with a stakeholder that doesn't get it. Um, how do you have the mindset to try and convince a stakeholder without basically going in with both feet first to show them? Is it just by looking at the metrics and showing them the deliverables of things that are happening, or and what if you don't have those metrics in place? How can you convince a stakeholder that this is the right path to take?
I think every stakeholder is different, and so you need to, uh, without being too brutal about it, play the person that's in front of you. Um, I think it's easier to talk about the things that are done badly, whereas kind of tech can be this black box to a lot of stakeholders. So don't explain the technology, explain how it's going to make their life easier, explain what outcome it's going to get to. And yes, that is all the outcomes I'm talking about, but it's also how is this going to make your life better, or how is this going to be effective for the teams that you're talking to? And so if you're talking to a finance stakeholder, that will often be driven by things like operational cost savings, the impact it can have on revenue. If you're talking to a marketing team, it's you'll be able to run these campaigns more effectively, or
Mhm.
you'll be freed up to not do some of the kind of standard work of campaigns, and automation becomes really important there. Then when you're talking to CEOs, I do think you tend to have to take a longer term vision and talk about it in terms of North Star. You then need to be prepared to explain the technology in an accessible way so that people don't feel like they're being railroaded into a decision. Um, but often it's about empathy and
Mhm.
communication and putting yourself in that person's shoes and going, no, generally no one wants to stop decisions from happening. They want to make the right decision, but they want to feel like they are a participant in that process. And I think that's why product people are often very good at managing stakeholders,
Yeah.
because they have to do it both downwards and sideways and upwards, and it can feel pretty
It's almost like a
thankless.
circle, isn't it?
It is, and so when you get to that point, it is often understanding the person and understanding what their incentives and motivations are,
Mm.
and also accepting that sometimes you won't manage it, because you can also be wrong.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to have a strong opinion weakly held, and being open to whatever you're hearing, because most of the time those stakeholders are experts in their own area and really understand either the business or the finance or the legal really deeply. And I think if you approach it with a view to let's make this decision together, and sometimes that does mean you have to trade off what you want, or you have to be a bit pragmatic about things. Um, but also, if you're doing product properly or stakeholder management properly, that it's very rare to come across a decision that's going to lock you in for 10 years.
Yeah.
In fact, if you're doing that, you probably need to be thinking about how you're approaching things a little better, because actually most stakeholders are looking no more than a quarter or 2 quarters ahead.
Yeah.
And actually, the hardest thing is persuading them to make longer term investments, and that's definitely been my experience. That's why actually getting to the CEO is often the important thing,
Yeah.
because they're the ones that often have the vision for the company or where they want to go. And it's not necessarily CEO, it's the person who is ultimately making decisions on a different horizon. And thinking about that when you're managing stakeholders is part of the empathy, understanding what horizon their decisions are, what's driving their decisions, but also be bold. Don't be afraid to go, I think it will have this impact, because what people are often looking for is to be as certain as possible. And this is the thing with product roadmaps. It is not promising a delivery date. It's promising that you will move towards a certain outcome. And that's often the thing that will persuade people.
Mhm.
Don't promise absolute exact things. Promise that you are trying to move things. And it is about, being able to deliver on change.
Yeah, and that's the main thing, right? It's being able to, as you say, deliver on something that's an outcome. Try and people talk about moving the needle, right? Changing
Yes,
changing that
and that
needle.
requires ambition, and that requires, innovation, because the world is not standing still. And so it's very easy to become stuck in frameworks, or to become stuck in this is the right decision. Actually, take it back to what are you trying to achieve and who are you trying to achieve it for? And communication, keeping things simple is so important in that stakeholder management because most people take decisions in the first 90 seconds of you speaking to them.
Yeah, you've not got long. Um, in terms of final question from me, looking back throughout your career, and if you were talking to someone who's perhaps coming up in the world of product or technology, like what's the one bit of advice that you might give them so that they can get to where they want to over the course of the next sort of 3 to 5 years?
It's so easy to just go experiment with the latest tools and technology. Uh, but for me, from a personal point of view, I would say, remember to be generous to people around you, be kind, because that compounds in a way that nothing else does.
Love that. Very simple, but very effective. Rafe, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you again. So thank you so
Thank you,
much for
Rupert.
giving up your time. Some really interesting nuggets of wisdom shared. So I'm really looking forward to getting this one out there.
Great. Thanks very much.